In a world that often hurries past the quiet ones, Henry Brooks stood tall despite the weight of years in a limp that told tales no one bothered to hear. His boots, scorched and frayed, carried scars from a day in 2005 when he drove through fire to save 9 lives in a desert inferno. At the DMV, where snickers and whispers met his every step, one man's trembling hands and weathered coat hid a courage most would never know. What happens when the past walks back into the present, demanding respect for a hero who never asked for it? Step into Henry's story, where silent valor speaks louder than words, and discover the power of seeing someone before it's too late. Henry Brooks didn't blink when the teenage boys snickered at his boots. Their frayed laces and scorched leather drawings stifled laughter. He didn't waver when the clerk, her voice sharp and impatient, muttered under her breath, "He probably just wandered in here." His coat hung loose, worn thin at the elbows, and his hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a lifetime of burdens carried in silence. No one in the crowded DMV bothered to ask why he limped or why the heels of his boots looked like they'd been kissed by fire. They couldn't know. They didn't know. Henry had once pulled 9 men from a burning convoy, his own life a small price to pay for theirs. He stepped into the DMV just 5 minutes after it opened, moving at his own measured pace. There was no hurry in him anymore, not after all he'd seen. His back was rigid, his right leg dragging just enough to tilt his stride. Those boots, nearly 2 decades old, clicked faintly against the cold tile floor. The leather near the toes was warped, smoothed out like melted wax from a long-ago flame. But Henry had polished them that morning with the same care he'd given them every day since. The boys in line, one elbowing the other, grinned and whispered, "Yo, check out Grandpa's boots. Look like they survived a war or something." The second boy snorted, "More like a yard sale disaster." Henry's face didn't change. He gave a small nod to the clerk behind the counter, sliding his manila envelope toward her with deliberate care. The woman barely looked up. "You need Form 14C, she snapped, shoving a stack of papers his way. "Fill it out and take a seat." Henry adjusted his glasses, his voice soft but steady. "Ma'am, I was told—" She cut him off. Sir, you're holding up the line." Behind him, a woman sighed heavily, her eyes glued to her phone. The teenagers kept whispering, their gazes locked on Henry's boots as if they were some relic from a forgotten era. He stepped aside, his hand gripping the counter-buttoned edge for balance. That tremor in his left hand wasn't nerves. It was the echo of a moment seared into his muscles, a memory of fire and chaos. A younger clerk leaned over, her whisper carrying too far. "Did he even walk here? Looks like he's lost in time." Henry eased himself into a chair by the wall, his movements slow but deliberate. The sunlight streaming through a high window caught the edges of his boots, and for a fleeting moment, they gleamed like polished gold. No one noticed. No one except a man standing outside, watching through the glass from the parking lot. His face was taut, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on Henry's uneven gait, the familiar limp, the telltale burn marks on those boots. He knew the story, heard it countless times from his father, one of the 9 men Henry had saved on a dusty road in Iraq. Long before the clerk's dismissive tone, before the boy's careless mockery, Henry Brooks had driven through hell. It was August 18, 2005, in the desert outside Fallujah, where the ground cracked under the unrelenting sun. Henry was 45 then, older than most in his unit, a combat transport driver with the 3rd Infantry. Not as fast as the younger soldiers, but steady, always steady. That day, 2 Humvees hit an IED. One flipped into a ditch. The other erupted in flames, fire pouring through the windows like a living thing. Screams cut through the desert air. Henry didn't hesitate. He threw his truck into gear, swung it toward the inferno, and drove straight into the heat. Bullets pinged off his windshield, cracking the glass, but he didn't stop. One by one, he dragged men from the burning wreckage, uniforms scorched, skin blistered. One soldier had no pulse, but Henry pulled him out anyway, refusing to leave him behind. That man survived. By the time backup arrived, Henry had collapsed from the smoke, his right leg forever changed. The doctors urged him to use a brace. He refused, saying a limp was better than forgetting how to walk at all. They awarded him a Bronze Star. He sent it to his sister in Ohio, never displaying it. Henry didn't speak of Fallujah, not at church, not at the diner, not even when someone asked about his uneven gait. Old bones, he'd say, brushing it off. But the scars told the truth. His boots told it too, if anyone cared to look. Outside the DMV, Major Daniel Ortiz stood frozen, his chest tight with recognition. He'd heard the story of Henry Brooks from his father, Corporal Luis Ortiz, one of the 9 men pulled from that fiery convoy. Now, watching Henry sit quietly, dismissed and mocked over paperwork, Daniel felt a surge of something deeper than anger. Gratitude, mixed with grief. He hadn't planned to stop at the DMV that morning. He was on his way to the base, his briefcase stuffed with paperwork, his day packed with meetings. But seeing Henry through the window, lone in that chair, tugged at something inside him. He hadn't seen Henry in nearly 15 years. Not in person, but his father's voice echoed in his mind. Every year, over a glass of whiskey, Luis would recount that day. Fire everywhere. Couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Then this guy, this older driver, yanks me out like I'm his own son. Didn't even flinch. Luis would pause, staring into the distance, his voice thick. Never got his name. Just dropped us at the medevac and disappeared. Daniel was 12 the first time he heard it, and the story had rooted itself in him, shaping the man he'd become. Now, standing in the parking lot, Daniel made a decision. He drove home, changed into his full-dress uniform, the one with the medals his father had insisted he wear with pride. From a shelf, he took a wooden case holding a folded flag, its edges worn from time. It had draped his father's casket years ago. His hands shook as he held it, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. He turned his car around and headed back to the DMV. Inside, Henry hadn't moved. The teenage boys had left, their laughter fading with them. The impatient clerk was gone too, replaced by 2 others who occasionally glanced his way, whispering. The door swung open and the sound of boots on tile silenced the room. Major Daniel Ortiz stepped forward, the flag cradled in his hands like something fragile. Henry looked up, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, he was back on that medevac pad, staring at a younger face with the same jawline, the same quiet strength. Daniel stopped 3 feet from Henry and saluted, his posture rigid, his gaze unwavering. The room froze. The wall clock ticked loudly in the silence. One clerk blinked rapidly, unsure if this was some kind of inspection. Another stood still, a half-stamped form forgotten in her hand. Daniel held the salute for 3 long seconds before lowering his hand. His voice was steady, cutting through the quiet. This man, he said, turning to face the room, pulled my father from a burning convoy in Iraq. 9 men would have died that day, my father among them. I owe my entire life to him. The room held its breath when the laughter stopped. The mocking snickers aimed at Henry Brooks' weathered boots faded into a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the walls of the DMV. Henry stood still, his eyes tracing the folded American flag in Major Daniel Ortiz's hands. The flag was held with reverence, its edges soft but deliberate, a symbol of something far greater than the worn fabric it was made of. Henry's gaze lingered, and with a slow, almost imperceptible nod, he acknowledged the moment. Behind the counter, a faint sniff broke the quiet. The younger clerk, who moments ago had whispered too loudly about Henry's appearance, now stood with tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed to her mouth as if to hold back the shame. The manager emerged from the back office, her eyes wide at the sight of the uniformed officer and the charged atmosphere. Is everything okay? She stammered, her voice barely cutting through the tension. Daniel didn't glance her way. Instead, he laid the flag gently on the counter, right atop a pile of Form 14Cs, as if claiming the space for something sacred. This is Henry Brooks, Daniel's voice carried a quiet authority. Bronze Star recipient, combat transport driver, Iraq, 2005. He saved 9 men from a burning convoy, and you left him waiting in the corner like he was invisible. The older clerk's fingers trembled as she typed furiously into the system, her earlier impatience replaced by urgency. We'll process his renewal immediately. No paperwork needed, she said, her voice cracking. Please, Mr. Brooks, take a seat. You don't have to stand. One of the teenage boys who had mocked Henry's boots earlier peeked through the glass door, catching sight of the flag in Daniel's uniform. His bravado vanished, and he slipped back outside, unnoticed. Henry's voice, low and rough like gravel underfoot, broke the silence. I didn't come here for trouble. Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile, his eyes steady. And that's exactly why you deserve more respect than any of us could ever repay. The air in the room shifted, as if the weight of Henry's story had settled into every corner. A woman in line stood and gestured to her chair. Please, Mr. Brooks, she said softly, her eyes apologetic. Another pulled a bottle of water from her bag and handed it to him with a nod. The DMV, once filled with sighs and eye rolls, now hummed with a quiet reverence. Henry didn't bask in the attention or point fingers. He didn't need to say, I told you so. Instead, he gave a small nod of gratitude and tugged at the sleeve of his worn coat, a habit that hid the faded patch on his left shoulder. He moved toward the counter with his slow, limping gait, and this time no one dared to rush him. The older clerk, still shaken, placed his new ID on the counter with care. I'm so sorry, Mr. Brooks, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Henry took the card with both hands, his fingers steady despite the years etched into them. Just Henry, he said softly. Never been one for titles. Major Ortiz stepped aside and their eyes met, a silent exchange that carried the weight of shared history, of lives forever tethered by one man's courage. No salute was needed this time, just the unspoken understanding between them. As Henry turned to leave, the room remained hushed. Even the copier in the corner seemed to pause, as if the machines themselves recognized the gravity of what had unfolded. Outside, the sunlight felt different, sharper, as it spilled across the pavement. Henry stopped by the sidewalk, his gaze dropping to his boots, cracked, blackened near the heels, but still holding strong. For years, people had sneered at them, called them relics, laughed at their ugliness. But those boots had carried him through fire, had borne the weight of 9 lives saved in a moment of chaos. A woman in her 30s held the door open for him, her young son trailing behind, tugging at her coat. Mom, who was that man? He asked, his voice curious. She watched Henry cross the street, her expression thoughtful. A reminder, she said after a pause, that we don't always know the stories of the people we pass beyond. Henry reached his truck, a rusted relic from another era, and eased into the driver's seat. The folded flag rested on the passenger seat, exactly where Daniel had placed it. He didn't smile, but the lines around his eyes softened, a quiet acknowledgement of the moment. Back at his small home, Henry set the new license on the kitchen table. It was just a piece of plastic, nothing more, but the way it had been given to him lingered in his mind. He moved slowly to the back room, a space he rarely visited, filled with boxes and memories that still carried the faint scent of desert sand and diesel fuel. From a wooden cabinet, he pulled a small tin, its edges worn smooth by time. Inside were 3 items: a faded photograph of 9 young men, their grins bright against the backdrop of a scorching Iraqi sun, their uniforms stained but proud, a dog tag melted and twisted from the heat of that day, and an unopened letter addressed to Henry in handwriting he hadn't seen in decades. He set the license beside them, then lifted the photograph, his eyes lingering on the faces of the men he'd pulled from the flames. Still standing, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, like I promised I would. Outside, the sounds of neighborhood life filtered through the window, children laughing, a basketball thudding against the pavement, the faint chime of a bicycle bell. Henry stepped onto his porch, one hand resting on the railing. The teenage boy from next door looked up from his bike and waved. Hey, Mr. Brooks, he called, his tone warm with respect. Henry nodded back. Keep your laces tight, he said, his voice steady. The boy paused, then grinned. Yes, sir. For the first time in years, Henry noticed something different. No one stared at his boots with judgment anymore. They were worn, yes, but they carried a story, a weight that demanded respect, not ridicule. The sun dipped low, painting the porch in hues of gold. Henry settled into his chair, his boots crossed at the ankles, the folded flag resting in his lap. Not every hero needs a monument carved in stone. Some just need to be seen, their quiet courage acknowledged before it fades into the dusk.